My name is Lawrence Hamm. I'm the chairman of the People's Organization for Progress, which is a grassroots organization working for racial, social, economic justice, and peace. We're based in Newark, but we're a statewide organization with about 10 branches in New Jersey and New York City.
If you would be so kind as to let me know about the significance of this location. We're standing on sacred ground, some might say. Can you tell me a little bit about where we're standing and why it's significant?
Right. The question being, why is this site important? We're standing here at the monument to those persons who were killed during the uprising in Newark, New Jersey in the summer of 1967, in July of 1967. This little park is roughly in the heart of the Central Ward of Newark, New Jersey. We're just actually 3 blocks away from the police precinct where the Newark Rebellion started on July 12, 1967. This monument was requested by citizens of Newark to remember the 1967 uprising and to remember those persons that died during that uprising. The person that was instrumental in placing this monument here was Councilman George Branch, who was councilman of the Central Ward at that time being, I guess, roughly in the mid-1980s. This monument was placed here, and it has the names of all the people. So this is sacred ground in the sense that this was ground zero for the 1967 uprising that started when a Newark cab driver, I believe Thomas Smith, was beaten by the police and taken to the 17th Avenue precinct, which is called the West District Precinct today. That precinct had a notorious reputation. People would say if you went in, you might not come out, and many times people went in uninjured and came out injured badly. After Mr. Smith was beaten and arrested and taken to the West District Precinct, rumor started that he may have been killed, and so there was a demonstration in front of the precinct from people in the neighborhood. This used to be one of the most highly populated neighborhoods in the United States. You can't see them anymore, but directly across from us was Stella Wright Housing Project, which was the scene of the longest rent strike in the history of the United States, led by a fellow named Toby Henry, who's still alive today. And right across the street from the West District Precinct on West Kenny were the Hayes Homes Housing Project. So you had Hayes Homes, you had Stella Wright, you had Scudder Homes, you had some other smaller housing projects down the street. So at one point, there were more people per square mile in this area of the Central Ward than in any place else in the United States. So it was not difficult to get a crowd of people to demonstrate in front of the West District Precinct. Well, that demonstrated resulted in a confrontation between the police and the demonstrators, and that is really what sparked the rebellion in Newark, which went on for 5 days. And we call it a rebellion because had it simply been a riot, it could have been contained and suppressed and put down by the police. But it took the Newark police, it took approximately 700 state troopers, it took the National Guard to come in, martial law was declared. That right there is the characteristic of a rebellion, when civil authority is suspended and martial law is implemented, and it took all of that to finally bring that uprising to an end. And that uprising was of course triggered by incident of police brutality, which triggered many uprisings around the country at that time. But it was also in response to the very terrible conditions that people faced in their day-to-day lives here in Newark, New Jersey.
Thank you so much. Could you please tell me about some of the conditions that people face? I know that the lore, the folklore that's going around the suburbs is oftentimes that the rebellion happened and then we had white flight. But in reality, we know that the Federal Housing Administration and a lot of other economic causes were draining money from cities like Newark beginning in the 1930s.
That's right.
So could you talk to me a little bit about the conditions on the ground that led up to the rebellion?
That's right. The deindustrialization and suburbanization of Newark, as you said, began prior to World War II and actually was accelerated after World War II with cheap land available to industry. They began to relocate, even at that time, relocate their plants and factories outside of the city of Newark. Some of which, many of which had been right inside. In fact, just 2 blocks away was a major employer, I believe GE plant, GE electrical plant was just 2 blocks away from here and employed hundreds of people. Well, they began to move out after World War II with cheap land and suburbanization. Remember, there was also the GI Bill, which enabled many that had served during World War II to get homes in the suburbs through low-interest loans that they could obtain through the GI Bill. So this flight, this drain on the Newark's population began before World War II, but was actually began to be accelerated by at the end of World War II and right through the 60s into the 70s. What we had in Newark in the 1960s really was a kind of apartheid system. Where we stand now, this spot is the Central Ward. In the old days, it was called the Third Ward. The city government was changed after World War II, and there were various forms put in place, but this was the old Third Ward. And as you know, because of industrialization in the South, and because of the oppressive conditions that African Americans faced in the South, we had a number of major migrations out of the South into the North, the Midwest, and the West. And as African Americans moved out of the South and came north, many came here to Newark, New Jersey. And because of housing discrimination and redlining and the refusal of banks to give loans to African Americans to buy houses in other parts of the city, we were redlined here in the Central Ward. In fact, by the time of the rebellion, which was 1967, or even several years before the rebellion, Newark was already a predominantly black city. But we did not have the proportionate representation on the city council. There's a 9-member city council, 5 ward council people, 4 at-large council people. But even though we were the majority in the city, we only had 1 black elected official. His name was Irvine Turner, after whom Belmont Avenue was renamed Irvin Turner Boulevard. So we had a kind of apartheid here where you had a majority black city, but we didn't have a black mayor, we didn't have a black majority on the city council, we didn't have our share of jobs in the city government, and so on and so forth. So that's a system, and we had outright racial discrimination here in Newark. I mean, people think that segregation, I'm talking about de jure, legal segregation, was just in the South. It was right here in the North as well. Up into the 1960s, many black people couldn't attend movie theaters downtown and sit where they wanted to. They had to sit in the balcony. That was the policy. Negroes had to sit in the balcony. Most black folk didn't even go downtown to shop. We shopped, so to speak, in our own neighborhoods here because of the racism that was exhibited toward us in downtown stores. For instance, a black person couldn't go into a hat store and try on a hat. You couldn't go in Bamberger's and try on a suit in the dressing rooms if you were black. This was right here in Newark, New Jersey. even federal housing was segregated, and segregated by the guidelines that came from the federal government. And there's a housing project that's being rehabbed now. I think it's going to be turned into private housing. It's right over on I can't, Sussex Avenue. It's right over there on Sussex Avenue. I can't remember the name of the project, but it's on Sussex Avenue. That housing project was literally split down the middle, one half for Negroes and the other side for whites. So this racial discrimination was not just something that existed in the South. It existed right here in Newark, New Jersey. Now that was the racial situation. The social situation was even worse. Newark had one of the highest rates of substandard housing in the country. At the time that I grew up, and I grew up right over on Ridgewood Avenue and Avon, in the central ward of Newark, many people lived in cold water flats. There was not hot and cold running water. You know, we had coal heat. You know, there was a significant deterioration in the housing that we lived in. We lived in old tenement slum buildings where landlords just collected rent, really didn't reinvest the money in terms of improving the housing. So Newark had one of the highest rates of substandard housing in the country, had one of the highest rates of unemployment and underemployment in the country. The school system, we went basically to segregated schools, not by law, but because of the housing discrimination. You know, black neighborhoods, all black schools, and so on and so forth. We had one of the highest rates of functional illiteracy in the nation. At the time that I was appointed to the Newark Board of Education in 1971, many high school seniors were graduating reading below the 5th grade level, which I believe was what defined functional literacy, if you couldn't read at a 5th grade level. So these, and of course, the issue that sparked the rebellion of 1967, police brutality was rampant. As early as 1966, African Americans were calling for the institution of a police review board here in Newark in an attempt to do something about the problem of police brutality.
Could you talk a little bit about this monument in particular and the importance of remembering this event today in general terms?
This monument here has the names of all the people that were killed during the rebellion in 1967. And our organization, People's Organization for Progress, was formed in 1983. Almost from the day that we formed our organization, we decided that we were going to commemorate the 1967 rebellion, because that was the seminal event in the Black Power movement here in the city of Newark. Most people know about the Civil Rights Movement. One of the great achievements, or let's say two of the great achievements of the Civil Rights Movement, was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Black Power movement essentially took what the Voting Rights Act made possible, that is, black people to vote, and actually put it into practice. In 1965, there were roughly 465 black elected officials in the city of Newark. In 1965, there were roughly 465 black elected officials in the nation as a whole. So, Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. By 1972, there were over 10,000 black elected officials in the country. So that really was the essence of the Black Power movement, was to give black people the political representation that they deserved had been denied. So there was a fella named Ken Gibson. Ken Gibson ran for mayor in 1966 and was defeated. The rebellion, we believe, was not just a physical uprising, but resulted in the transformation of political consciousness in the city. One has to keep in mind that after 1967, when Ken Gibson was finally elected, he was elected by a very narrow margin. Adonisio had been indicted and was under indictment and almost still won the election. Many of us believe had it not been for the uprising, and other events that happened between 1966 and 1970, that election of the first black mayor of Newark would not have happened. It was a socially transformative event. And it was out of this rebellion and the aftermath of the rebellion that my generation, many of us, became activists. Now, keep in mind, I was 12 years old when the rebellion happened in 1967, so there were other activists already on the scene, protesting and doing all that. But my generation was influenced by them. We were influenced by them. We were not only influenced by them, we were influenced by the Civil Rights Movement. We were influenced by the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I mean, we were kids looking at television, so we saw all this happen on television. So we said, if those young people could stand up for justice, we should stand up for justice too. That's why many of us became activists in high school. But to go back, Gibson ran for mayor in 1966, lost. There was a rebellion in Newark in 1967. The people rose up, and out of that rebellion came the movement that led finally to Gibson's election. Many people don't know that literally 2 weeks after the rebellion in 1967, there was a Black Power conference held in Newark, right downtown Newark, literally days after martial law had been lifted. This happened in July. And it was out of that Black Power conference that some of the plans were made that led eventually to the movement that brought about Gibson. After that Black Power conference, in the summer of 1967, there was a Black Power convention held right there at West Kenny Junior High School. Many people don't know that. Right there, at West Kenny Junior High School, was a Black Power convention where people began to organize and mobilize and prepare the basis for the election that would come in 1970. And then they're at what was then called Clinton Place Junior High School, which is now University High, was the Black and Puerto Rican Convention of 1969. So you had this convention movement with the Black Power Convention in Newark literally 2 weeks after the rebellion, the Black Power Convention in 1968 at West Kenny Junior High School, the Black and Puerto Rican Convention at then Clinton Place Junior High School, now University High, and out of that came the coalition. The Community Choice Team came out of the Black and Puerto Rican Convention in 1969. Ken Gibson was on that team. For Mayor, Sharp James was on that team. For South Ward Councilman, Dennis Westbrooks was on that team. For Central Ward Councilman, I believe Earl Harris may have been on that team. So we were successful. Well, I say we, I'm talking in the broadest collective sense. Were successful in getting Gibson elected, Sharp James elected, Dennis Westbrooks elected. So we got the mayor, but we didn't get a majority on the council. But that was the beginning in terms of getting Gibson elected in 1970. And that was the beginning of the political transformation here in Newark, because prior to that, Hugh Adonisio was the mayor. You know, everything was controlled by his group. You didn't see too many black people working downtown, working in City Hall, working in these major corporations, but that began to change after Gibson was elected in 1970. And it also, it all just didn't turn on and off. It didn't end with the election of Gibson. There were other movements that came behind that. As I mentioned, a fella named Toby Henry led the Toby Henry led the longest rent strike in the history of the country, right here at Stella Wright. What used to be, it's not there anymore, but Stella Wright Housing Project. We had a student movement out, and I came out of that student movement in 1971, where students were organizing for more power and more say in the policies that control the educational system. There were all kinds of movements that sprung up and continued to fight after the election of Gibson in 1970.
Their representation, visibility, was the 1969 takeover of Hamm at Rutgers Newark.
That's right.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, whatever you're familiar with.
Well, I am somewhat familiar. I wasn't a Rutgers student at that time. I was still a senior. I was still a student at Arts High School in 1969. But the students at Rutgers took over what I believe was the maintenance building on Washington Street, and they had a sit-in. In fact, one of those students became one of my colleagues on the Newark Board of Education. Her name was Vicki Donaldson, but the actual effort was led by some other young people at that time, but I believe Vicki Donaldson was part of that group that took over that maintenance building. The students were in an organization called BOSS, Black Organization of Students, and they took over that building to demand various changes in recruitment of students and admissions policies and changes in the curriculum and hiring of black faculty and staff, curriculum changes, more black and third world studies, etc., etc. That was a very important movement too that occurred in 1969, which is prior to the election of Ken Gibson. And I have to say this, many young people were very aware and very active in 1969. Now, you know, I was actually trying to catch up to some of my friends, you know, because, you know, people's consciousness were very high. People were part of there were all kinds of organizations in Newark. One of the strongest, of course, was the Committee for Unified Newark, led by Mary Baraka, who still lives in the city. Mary Baraka played a key role in the election of Mayor Gibson. In fact, the Committee for Unified Newark grew out of an organization that was called United Brothers. The United Brothers worked with Ken Gibson prior to 1969, and that evolved into some organizations. One was called Committee for Unified Newark, which was here in Newark, New Jersey. The other one was BCD, Black Community Development, led by Balozi Zaid Harvey, and there were other organizations. But even beyond that, you had some of the traditional civil rights organizations like CORE. Well, a lot of people don't know that CORE was active in Newark. In fact, I'm told that the very first civil rights demonstration was in the 1950s, led by CORE. It was in front of the White Castle, right down here on Elizabeth Avenue, Elizabeth and Hawthorne, because the White Castle wouldn't hire black people. Now, that was a black neighborhood, but they didn't hire no black people, so CORE had a demonstration down there. You had NCUP that had come in, Tom Hayden and his groups, but there were many the Black Panther Party was here in Newark. Their headquarters was right behind my high school, Arts High, down there just above Branford Place. There used to be another organization that was where that new post office is right now. It was called the Black People's Topographical Center. They were here in Newark, and they would take you on. They had tours and would show you how the black population was being moved out of the cities and so on and so forth. So there were many organizations, and of course the NAACP, which has almost 100-year history here in the city of Newark. So the fight for civil rights has been going on in this city for a long time, and all of those forces kind of came together in 1967. And people think, like, when they think about the rebellion in Newark in 1967, they think that Newark was the only rebellion. Every major city in New Jersey had an uprising. In fact, Newark wasn't even the first. Jersey City had an uprising in 1966. You know, and plus we were keeping our eyes on what was happening in other parts of the country. There was the Watts Rebellion in 1966. You know, there was an uprising in Harlem. I believe that was in 65. And a lot of people don't know that between 1960 and 1972, there were more than 1,000 urban uprisings in the United States. That's why a lot of people thought that we were on the verge of some kind of revolution in the United States, because there were so many uprisings. Now, we all didn't know about all these other uprisings because they weren't all covered by the press and so on and so forth. But, you know, that's what was going on. That together with the civil rights movement.
Regarding the way the city has chosen to remember or forget the rebellion, I was trying to go through the archives of the New Jersey Historical Society and at the Public Library, and it seemed that so many forces came together for the 40th anniversary. You had people coming from Washington, you had people coming from National Public Radio, you had people coming from Democracy Now! So I was wondering if you could speak about the 40th anniversary and why you thought, you know, some people say that enough time had passed for people to be able to talk about it, and that was impossible earlier. What do you think led to it being such a large public collective commemoration?
Well, it's hard for me to say specifically why the 40th anniversary became so important. I guess there's something about the year 40, you know. The children of Israel wandered in the desert for 40 years. Jesus was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Moses went up to the mountain 40. Something about that number 40. And I guess also with 40, you would still have some of the people around who were there in 1967. Like, by the time we get to the 50th anniversary, many people will have passed on. They won't be here. But when we've been having our commemorations, we thought it was important to commemorate the rebellion because there are lessons to be drawn from that rebellion. Like, if you don't correct these conditions that people live in, there's going to be another rebellion. It's not going to end. You know, it may take a long time, and certainly I'm not trying to predict anything, and certainly no one wants to see the city on fire again. Nobody wants that, but where there's oppression, there's resistance. And people will resist in all kinds of ways. And it may be through social protest, but it may be, you know, it's funny because, like, a week before the rebellion in 1967, I'm trying to remember, I think it was Irvin Turner who was actually interviewed by NBC, and they asked him if there was going to be an uprising in Newark like there had been in Harlem and like there had been in Watts, and he said no. You know, everything was okay. And then a week later, the city exploded. You can't really predict these things, but you know, if you don't change the conditions, there's going to be another uprising. So we commemorate the rebellion. We have this ceremony every year because we want people to draw lessons from what happened in the past to apply to the present. Like today in Newark, New Jersey, we have 22% unemployment. That's double depression level unemployment. Depression level unemployment is 10%. We got 22% unemployment in Newark right now. In the state of New Jersey, we have 9.8%. So we almost have depression level unemployment statewide. The fourth highest rate of unemployment in the country is right here in New Jersey. So we see many of the conditions that existed in 1967 and still exist today, and if we don't do something to correct those conditions, we may see a similar outcome. And in terms of why there was so much attention on the 40th, and I think one of the reasons is because of the number 40, and also because if they wait any longer, many of the people who are alive today won't be here. When we have our commemorations, we actually have some of the relatives of the family and family members of those who died. They come to our commemoration and they tell us what happened. They tell us how their loved one was killed. You know, in '67 during the rebellion, the news media was saying that there were snipers and that snipers had killed all these people. But then when they did the research, when the medical examiner examined the bodies of the people killed, examined the caliber of the bullets that were fired, these were bullets that came from the National Guard, primarily the Newark police and the state police. You know, people were talking about how a lot of stores were vandalized. Well, one of the things that happened was that the stores that were black owned, people sold Soul Brother on the windows of those stores, and those stores didn't get looted. So when the guard and the state police came in here, they shot out the windows of the stores that had Soul Brother written on them. But many people don't know that. Many people don't know the scope of this rebellion. You know, we talk about 27 or 26 people officially killed, but some of the survivors say that more people than this were killed. It's just that they were not counted in the official number. We know for a fact that over 1,500 people were wounded and more than 3,000 people were arrested. That's huge in terms of the dimensions. Many people are not aware of that. So we have this every year to remember what happened, the catastrophic dimensions of what happened, to try to draw lessons from it, to direct our efforts today, because the struggle for justice goes on today. It didn't end in 1967. And why they chose the year 40, I guess that's just a good number. A lot of people are still alive because they may not be here in the 50th. I'm sure the 50th anniversary will be just as big as the 40th anniversary was. And keep in mind that even though we haven't had another rebellion in Newark, well, there was actually, after 1967, there was a Puerto Rican rebellion. People don't talk about that. That, I believe, occurred in 1974, and that was also in response to the police and what the police were doing. But there have been other major rebellions that have occurred since 1967. I mean, look at Los Angeles, what happened in the aftermath of the beating of Rodney King. Rodney King didn't even get killed, but the police were so vicious in LA that sparked a rebellion. There have been other cities that have had rebellions, and these things will continue to occur until we correct the conditions that cause people to be angry and cause people to want to fight back. In terms of how we hold these commemorations, the very first commemoration we had of the 1967 rebellion, we had it I believe it was in 1984, and we call it the Black Liberation March. And that's when the People's Organization for Progress t-shirts were all red. We had all red t-shirts. You had a silhouette on the front of a head, and within the head, the space where the brain would be, it said Black Liberation. That was our t-shirt back then. But what we did, we had these Black Liberation marches, and we would march to all the important sites that were related to the rebellion. We would start up here at Fairmont Avenue, where Thomas Smith was beat. We would walk over to the precinct where he was arrested and where the confrontation took place that started the rebellion. We'd march through the Stella Wright housing project and other places that were related to the rebellion, and then we'd always end with a rally. Now, before this monument was erected, we usually ended the rally down like in the Stella Wright housing project or up in the Hayes Homes project. But then after this monument was erected, we would begin and end our event here. And then we formally called, to bring more focus on the rebellion itself, we began to call it a commemoration of the 1967 rebellion, to give it even more focus. And we would start here and end here. We'd start here and march over to the precinct, march back. We'd have a rally here. We usually start with a moment of silence. We usually have children lay flowers here at the foot of the monument. And we try to give everybody a chance to speak that wants to speak. The first people we give an opportunity to speak are the family members, the survivors of those who were killed during the rebellion. We let them speak. Then after they all speak, we ask for people who were in Newark at the time of the rebellion. We let all of them speak, say what they have to say, and then we open it up to anybody else who wants to say anything, that is related to the event that we're commemorating. And these commemorations usually last about 2 hours, and sometimes they go longer, depending on the year. From year to year, the interest may increase or decrease. Some years the crowds are very large, some years the crowds are small, but we continue to do them, and like we're at a point now where we don't even have to send out a notice. Everybody knows that on July 12th, the People's Organization for Progress will have a commemoration that will probably be here 5:30 or 6 o'clock, start, and go till about 8, and people know that, and they just come. And not only do the grassroots community folks show up, but academics come, writers, who've written about the rebellion or written about Newark. They come, of course. We always try to ask Amiri Baraka, who was one of the leaders at that time, to speak. There have been several college professors from Rutgers that have come to speak. So we try to make it as democratic as possible. We try to give everybody that wants to speak an opportunity to speak, and we ask people to talk about what happened then, but we also ask them to relate it to what's going on now. And we always try to bring it from the past to the present, and also looking forward to what we must do in the future.
A lot of people speak about the Black coalitions, whether it's the Black Organization of Students or people like Julius Williams organizing against the building of UNDMJ.
Right.
You mentioned the Puerto Rican and the Black coalition working together. Could you speak a little bit more about these kinds of cross-racial partnerships that were going on in the city?
Right. Well, historically, one aspect of the Black Power movement was the fact that we were trying to build coalitions and alliances with other oppressed peoples. And African Americans and Puerto Ricans have lived in this city for a long time and faced similar problems. During the Black Power movement, you remember there was the Black Panther Party, but there was also the Brown Berets out of New York City, which modeled itself on the Black Panther Party, and was trying to raise similar issues that were affecting Latino communities in New York and other places. And also there were similar organizations being organized, similar efforts among Chicanos out in the West, and so on and so forth. So there's always been this realization among the leadership of the Black Power movement that it's in the interest of both peoples to make coalitions and alliances to strive for a common goal. Now, one of the outcomes of that was, of course, we got Ken Gibson elected, but in elections subsequent to the election of Ken Gibson, we had Latino candidates, and there were tickets that had both African American and Latino candidates on them. Now, most of them were not successful, but the effort was made because there was a realization: if you got a large Latino population, they should have representation on the city council too. It's not that we want all the representation, we just want our fair share. You have your fair share, everybody have their fair share, and then we try to work together for the common good of the city as a whole. But this realization of the need for coalition building has a long history in the African American freedom struggle. It didn't just begin in the 60s, it goes back even further than that.
You mentioned women's liberation for progress and the Chicano movement, some of the other third world liberation fronts that were going on. Gender seems to me something that we don't talk about when it comes to the rebellion. And I interviewed Linda Epps, who was part of the New Jersey Historical Society for a long time.
Yes.
And she had let me know that there was actually a woman, an African American woman who was a state trooper at the time, that when the rebellion broke out, came down from another state just to make sure that the women were not being sexually oppressed.
Wow.
And that's part of the history that is not recorded.
Now, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so when I find out more, I'll send it along to you as well, because that seems like a big piece of the puzzle that we don't talk about.
Yes.
Because all of a sudden we have images of men, whether they're the mythical black sniper, or the male state troopers or the male National Guard.
Right.
So I was wondering if we could speak about the victims, the people that gave up their lives for this.
Yes.
And if you could tell me just anything that you know about the names on this plaque.
Right. Well, in terms of the victims, in terms of women, as you can see, there are a number of women among the victims, among the 26, 27 victims here. The granddaughter and children of Rose Abrams, they come almost every year. And she was very tragic because she was shot. State troopers were firing into the projects, because people say, well, there's a sniper up there, so people just start shooting. And they shoot into the projects. Sometimes bullets go directly into people's windows. Sometimes they ricochet off and go in. But she was killed in her apartment. And her children saw their mother killed. They were hiding under, she told them to get under the bed. They were hiding under the bed. There were women with children who were killed during the rebellion. Their children saw them die. It's really terrible. And this is an area where I think more work has to be done in terms of zeroing in on the role that women played in the contemporary period. I mean, we know more about the role women played in this, or at least some women played in the civil rights movement, because a lot of those women were smart enough to write about it themselves, such as the Women's Political Committee down there in Montgomery, Alabama, that actually did the early footwork that got the Montgomery bus boycott started, which in fact launched Dr. King into national prominence. We know about people like Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and many others. But in terms of the period coming forward, say the Black Power period, we know about iconic figures like Angela Davis. But there were many other women who played important roles. I know for a fact, because I'm an eyewitness to history, I saw many women leaders at the grassroots level, in the aftermath of the 1967 rebellion, worked with them. I know for a fact these movements would not have been possible had it not been for the participation of women. And it is a fact that in terms of recognition, many of the leaders that were recognized were male, but they were the titular leaders, so to speak, on a movement whose base may have been majority female, for that matter. I mean, we talk about the black church, and the role the black church has played historically in the freedom struggle. I mean, most of the pastors are men, but the congregations, many of them are majority female. And those women have in many instances been the foot soldiers, and not just the foot soldiers, have been unsung heroes because they played leadership roles, but they didn't get the recognition, say, that the male leaders got. So this is an area of work for future academics or present academics to go into, to unearth, the role that women played, I should say unearth it more so, because we do have some idea. I mean, in the 1970s, we see people like Shirley Chisholm. I mean, we talk about Barack Obama today, but many people don't know Shirley Chisholm ran for president in 1972. I know about this because I was a participant in the National Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana in 1972. So I was following the presidential campaign, and I knew about Shirley Chisholm's campaign for president. So, and there have been other Shirley Chisholms. They didn't run for president, but they've run for mayor, they've run for governor, they've run for city council, at many levels. In fact, today we have many black elected officials that are female, and many grassroots leaders, non-elected officials that are also female. So I know for a fact this movement would not be possible were it not for the participation of women. And I think this is something that we have to draw on for the future, that our strength is greatest when we work together as equals. When we work together, men and women work together on an equal footing, it strengthens the whole movement. You know, when attempts are made to minimize the role that women play, to not give them the recognition they deserve, or to not involve them at the levels that they should be involved, it weakens the movement. I mean, in the 60s and in the 70s, and I can speak more so to the 70s, I know for a fact that there were families where, say, the mothers and the wives wanted to participate, but their husbands wouldn't let them participate, or their participation might be frowned upon. It was thought that their best place was in the home with the children, that they shouldn't go to meetings, and so on and so forth. That weakens the movement. That doesn't strengthen the movement, you know. And so we have to do all that we can to ensure women's participation, to ensure women's leadership, you know, and to work together on an equal footing. When we work together as equals, we're strong. In terms of how do we use the rebellion to inspire people to take action today, one of the things, when People's Organization for Progress was first started, it was mainly a collective based here in Newark, New Jersey. We have since grown into an organization that has branches throughout New Jersey. We even have a branch in New York City. One of the things that we do is, if any of our branches are in communities and cities that had rebellions, we ask those branches to hold commemorations just like we have here in Newark. So at one time, everybody used to come here for the Newark commemoration, but now our other branches are having commemorations of their rebellions. In particular, our Plainfield branch has had a number of commemorations already. I would say at least for the last 5 or 6 years, they've been commemorating the rebellion that even happened in little bedroom town Plainfield. You know, in fact, one of the characteristics of that rebellion that was different from Newark was that in Plainfield, African Americans seized the armory. There was an armory in Plainfield, and they actually seized the armory, and there was a standoff between the police and the people that had seized the armory. So, from a historical point of view, we urge people that live in areas that had uprisings to go back, do the research, and commemorate that, to show how people struggle. People have to have an understanding that whatever rights and benefits they have today are the result of efforts of those who came before yesterday. You know, like many people don't know today that there was racial segregation in Newark, and that there were organizations like the NAACP, like CORE, and like other organizations that fought to break that racial segregation down, that fought against discriminatory housing policies and discriminatory employment policies, so people today can live wherever they want to live. They need to know that it wasn't always like that. And see, and in teaching people that lesson, then it helps them to understand that for future progress, they have to struggle. Just as other people struggle for us, we have to struggle for those generations that will come behind us. And I think African Americans have an acute awareness of this because of our particular history in this country. Not only our history of oppression, but our history of struggle against that oppression. We are people who were enslaved in this country, who were taken out of our homeland homelands in Africa by the millions. We were enslaved in these colonies and in these United States for 245 years, up until the time of the Civil War. Now, it took a civil war to end that slavery. In fact, more Americans died. People don't know this. More Americans died in the Civil War than in all the other wars we fought combined. 750,000 Americans died during the Civil War. And it took that to end slavery. The passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which made us citizens, and the 15th Amendment, which gave us the right to vote. Many of our folks right here in New Jersey don't know that New Jersey was very much in sympathy with the South. That when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the New Jersey legislature nullified Lincoln's power to emancipate slaves in the state. When the 13th Amendment was passed, New Jersey was not among the 27 state majority to ratify the 13th Amendment to end slavery. That Lincoln didn't win New Jersey in 1860, he didn't win New Jersey in 1864. So you could kind of see the roots of racism that was here. Many people don't know slavery was here in New Jersey, that one of the most active slave ports on the East Coast was Perth Amboy. And then after that was Camden on the Delaware River. That's how a lot of slaves got into the agricultural areas of southern New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. And that was a world that was changed because people fought against the odds. It must have seemed like an impossibility to abolish slavery at one point, but people fought against it nonetheless. And those that had the most to gain fought whether the odds were in their favor or not, because they fought because they had to fight. So we ended slavery through collective effort. And then there was a process where we were nearly re-enslaved after the Civil War, and they had the system of Jim Crow segregation, and then came the Civil Rights Movement and abolished Jim Crow segregation. I mean, I can remember in my lifetime George Wallace standing in the doorway of the university, segregation now, segregation forever. In fact, we just passed the anniversary of the Little Rock Nine, where it took they had to federalize the National Guard in Arkansas because they didn't trust the governor because he was a Southern segregationist. They federalized the National Guard. They brought in the 101st Airborne Division. So it took the Guard, it took the U.S. Army, plus state and local police to get 9 black children into one high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And then we just had October 1st was the anniversary of James Meredith. It took 3,000 troops to get one black man into Ole Miss, into the University of Mississippi. People have to know that history to understand where they are now and what their purpose is, and how others fought for us. And we, therefore, have a responsibility to fight for ourselves. I mean, we're not just fighting for some abstract future generations. We're fighting to improve things in our lifetime so that everybody can live a better life. But this is I guess, the major lesson that we draw from the Rebellion of '67. It's like Frederick Douglass said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. I mean, let me just talk about my own life, right? I was a kid at the time of the '67 rebellion. I lived right up the hill here on South 12th Street. I saw that rebellion break out from my porch, from my second floor porch. But after the rebellion, what happened? Programs were put in place, model cities programs, United Community Corporation anti-poverty programs. I benefited from those programs. I was a kid that benefited from the after-school recreation programs that Title I made possible. I was a kid that benefited from a change in recruitment policies in universities across this country. I ended up going to Princeton University. My mother was a seamstress in the Hoffmanizing Cleaners on 16th Street. She couldn't afford to send me to Princeton University. In fact, Princeton was at one time a university that didn't accept black people. People got to remember, it was not only the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, it was also the Higher Education Act. That was another act that was passed during the turbulent 1960s. And the passage of that Higher Education Act made it possible for kids like me out of the inner city, the Central Ward of Newark, and the inner cities of cities across this country to go to universities, great and small, private and public, that heretofore did not accept our people. And because we got into those schools, we were able to get into jobs that made more money than our parents made, and so we could live a better life than they did. It's very clear in my life, how that struggle made things better for me. Now, what we know is after the rebellions of the 60s, there was a reaction, on the part of the power structure. I mean, Dr. King hadn't even been assassinated. If you read Dr. King's last speeches, you read the stuff that he wrote, the articles and speeches he wrote in 1967 and in 1968 before he was assassinated, he was already decrying the fact that the United States had turned its back on the struggle for desegregation, had turned its back on the war on poverty. He noticed that in his own lifetime. And so we certainly see that by the assassination of Dr. King, remember, King was assassinated in 68, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated 2 weeks after that, and what happened also in 68? Richard Nixon was elected. And with the election of Richard Nixon, we see the beginnings of the attempt to roll back all the gains that the struggles of the civil rights movement, the struggles of the Black Power movement, the urban rebellions, all those gains that those actions made possible, they began to work to roll them back. And that began as early as 1968, and continues to this day. I mean, right now, as we stand on the eve of the presidential election, one of the big issues is what? Is the passage of all these voter suppression laws. In about 30 states, they've passed these voter ID laws, and everybody knows that the purpose of these laws is to suppress the votes of minorities, of poor people, senior citizens, the traditional constituencies of the Democratic Party. Everybody knows that. But isn't it amazing that after all that we went through to get the Voting Rights Act passed, and on top of these voter suppression laws that have been passed, there are court cases going on right now to challenge the Civil Rights Act, to challenge the Voting Rights Act. There are people who literally want to take these acts, statutes, laws off the books. And we've already seen the impact of the attempts to roll back the game. We've seen declining levels of African Americans in colleges and graduate schools and so on and so forth. Not only African Americans, but also other minorities too. So we know what Frederick Douglass says: if there is no struggle, there is no progress. But we also know that if we are not vigilant to preserve the gains that we fought for, they will be taken away. And this not only applies to African Americans, to the civil rights movement, and so on and so forth, it applies to the struggles of working people regardless of race. I mean, a lot of people don't know, we didn't always have an 8-hour workday. There was a time when you worked, the boss told you to come to work at dawn, and you worked till dusk. You worked from sunup till sundown. People had to fight for the right to have an 8-hour workday. There was a time in the United States when it was against the law for people to organize unions. You could get arrested for being a union organizer. And there was a time when people would go on strike regardless of the law, and the police and private security firms would be called in, and they would shoot people down dead on picket lines. I mean, this is a part of U.S. history. This is the other history they don't teach. They don't teach African American, Latino history, Native American history, women's history, but they also don't teach labor history. The right to organize, the right to collectively bargain for higher wages. All of these things we fought for. Stuff that we take for granted today, like Social Security and unemployment insurance. These things didn't always exist. When Roosevelt tried to get the law passed for federal Social Security, because it already existed in a few states, I believe it was the National Businessmen's Association or the National Association of Industry and Manufacturers started a campaign to smear Roosevelt's name, to make him seem like he was crazy. How dare you say that we have an obligation to take care of people in their senior years. These things, Social Security, unemployment insurance, Medicare and Medicaid. People talk about the turbulent 60s. Medicare and Medicaid were created in the 60s. They came out of the war on poverty, the direct result of the Civil Rights Movement. So people only talk about the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, but there was the Higher Education Act, there was Medicare, Medicaid, and so on and so forth. The point being is that almost anything that we have in terms of a social safety net, in terms of social progress for people today, all those things were struggled for. They were either struggled for by the labor movement, the civil rights movement. I mean, just think about this. Women, it wasn't until the 20th century that women had the right to vote. You know, when we talk about black people got the right to vote, it was black men that got the right to vote. Women didn't get the right to vote until the beginning of the 20th century. And women had to do what? Just like everybody else, they had to protest, they had to demonstrate, they had to get arrested, they were beaten, they were hurt, you know, they sacrificed in many ways, but they persevered and finally got the right to vote. So all of these things that we have that benefit us today were won through struggle. That's lesson one. Lesson two is that you have to be vigilant to preserve those gains. If you're not vigilant, they will be taken from you. You know, history is not like a story on television, you know, with a beginning, middle, and end, and the ending, we won and it's over. No, this is one long battle that goes back and forth. Sometimes we surge forward, sometimes we push back, but to keep going forward, we have to keep fighting. Even when we fight and lose, that in and of itself is a victory. Defeat is part of victory. You can't have one without the other. On the road to victory will be many defeats, but each defeat helps you get stronger and better for the next fight and the ultimate victory that we will have. And I believe just as we made progress in the 60s, I believe that we will have another period where we will make progress again. We're going to be forced to, you know, we're going to be forced to, whether we want to or not. Sometimes it's beyond. I mean, sometimes we make a conscious decision, yes, I'm going to get involved, but then sometimes our own conditions force us to get involved. But I think that in terms of the future, you know, this fight is going to manifest itself again. It's going to break out again. I can't say exactly how. It's not going to be a repeat of the 60s. It's not going to be a carbon copy. It's going to be different with different issues and different constituencies. Some of the same constituencies, different constituencies. Some of the same strategy and tactics, different strategy and tactics. Some of the same issues, different issues. But the bottom line is the fight will go on, and ultimately we will make progress.